Hey guys, thanks for checking in on the NFN Radio News Podcast, brought to you by NotFakeNews.biz. I'm Bob Gaddy, editor and publisher of Not Fake News. Today we're welcoming New York attorney Michael Kaplan, an expert on brain injury law, and guest co-host, attorney-author Mark M. Bello, whose ripped from the headlines legal thrillers are all the rage on Amazon. We're going to talk today about traumatic brain injuries, what can happen when an injury has occurred, and what legal options are available to victims and their families. Mark, let's begin.
I want to ask Michael a question to get started, if that's okay. The term, Michael, traumatic brain injury, sounds very serious, obviously, but a traumatic brain injury, from my experience as a practicing lawyer, can result from a lot of different things, A, and B, can manifest itself in a lot of different ways. There's different parts of the brain that can be affected. There's different types of injuries that can cause a TBI. You can go from a little bump on the head to a concussion to something more serious. And I'm wondering if you can just quantify for us what a, quote, traumatic brain injury is and the kinds of things that people could look for to determine whether they have one, and to take that a step further, when they should contact a doctor and when they should contact a lawyer.
Well, that's enough questions that we could go on all day. First, let me thank you for inviting me on your program today. It's an honor to be with you. But let's get into this. A traumatic brain injury is a term of art used to distinguish this type of damage to the brain as opposed to damage caused by what's known as an acquired brain injury. An acquired brain injury being something like a stroke or a brain hemorrhage or a brain aneurysm or a birth-related injury. When we're talking about a traumatic brain injury, we're speaking about literally some type of traumatic event that has been involved as the cause of the injury. The Centers for Disease Control has looked at this and has created some categories for where these injuries come from. Interestingly enough, the most predominant cause of traumatic brain injuries are falls. Falls either in young children or in persons over the age of 65, striking their head when they hit the ground. The next most frequent cause of brain injuries would be motor vehicle accidents or any type of vehicle accident, or pedestrians being struck by a vehicle and again falling. Domestic violence is another frequent cause of traumatic brain injuries, which unfortunately goes oftentimes unrecognized, and we could spend just hours just talking about that. Assaults in general are a large cause of brain injuries, as well as injuries that happen in the world of sports. So there are many, many ways that a person can have a traumatic brain injury. And what I like to say, and this is not something that I've invented, comes from the Brain Injury Association of America. Anytime, anywhere, any place is a good way to think about a traumatic brain injury. Traumatic brain injuries, unfortunately, are unpredictable as to when they're going to occur. They're unpredictable as to who is going to be afflicted, and they're very unpredictable as to the outcome of the brain injury. Because while medical professionals look at brain injuries and they look at them on terms as such as mild, moderate, or severe, they're not really talking about the outcome of the brain injury and the long-term consequences. They're looking at the original injury. But I could tell you this, there's nothing mild about a mild brain injury if it's your brain. So we've seen people who have sustained concussions, which is a type of a brain injury, who've had worse outcomes than someone who's had bleeding in the brain or a skull fracture or something of that nature. Each brain injury is unique to that individual, and it could affect an individual in a variety of ways. We have cognitive problems that develop in terms of memory problems, concentration problems, the inability to juggle more than one thing at the same time, which is referred to as multitasking. We have physical problems that develop, headaches, dizziness, nausea, inability to sleep or sleeping too much. We have sensitivity to bright light and sounds. We have emotional problems and behavioral problems that develop, depression. We have problems in disinhibition, saying the most inappropriate things or doing the most inappropriate things. And it really depends on what portion of the brain was injured, because there are areas of the brain, different lobes of the brain that control different aspects of who we are. The effect of a brain injury depends somewhat on the area of the brain that was initially injured. So everybody is different, every fall is different, every injury is different, and it's just hard to give you a general answer to that question. But in looking at this today, in the year 2021, you can't pick up a newspaper on any given day without finding at least one article about brain injury. And I teach a course on brain injury law at the George Washington University Law School. And every semester, the first class, I will pick up USA Today and the Washington Post and bring it to class. And I'm telling you, for the last 7 years that I've been teaching this course, without fail, every time I pick up the papers, I will find at least one article discussing some aspect of brain injury, whether it's returning service members who are coming back with blast injuries, causing cognitive problems, behavioral problems, whether it's in the world of sports with young individuals or professional athletes or anybody in between suffering concussions, whether it's the National Football League when we're talking about a condition known as chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, which causes people to behave in bizarre ways and even commit suicide, whether it's children returning to the classroom that have problems learning because they sustained a concussion and now we're going back to school, and what do we do with them? It's a senior citizen who falls and has a fractured hip and now can't live independently, not because their hip hasn't healed, but because in addition to suffering that fractured hip, they've suffered a brain injury, and that prevents them from living independently. Whether it's anyone who sustained a very severe brain injury, and now the way our health system is set up is confined to a nursing home to get the care that they need on a 24/7 basis, when they should really be at home getting care from their family. Whether it's issues with parents or spouses who say, I'm no longer a parent, I'm a nurse to my child. Or I'm no longer a spouse, this is not the same person I married anymore. Or when we talk about issues involving domestic violence, where the Centers for Disease Control again tell us that 4 or 5 victims of domestic abuse have suffered a traumatic brain injury. When we look at the prison population and we find out that almost 90% of the prison population has had a head injury in some time during their life. And it goes on and on and on. Today, we read in the newspaper more information about something known as this Havana Syndrome, the signs and symptoms that embassy personnel have developed in Cuba, in Canada, and now even in the United States, as a result of what we believe are sonic booms being bombarding these embassies and consulate buildings. And we don't know who is doing this. It's something that the Trump administration looked at. and wasn't happy with the responses that they were getting from the Department of Defense or the Department of State. And in today's papers, we know that the Biden administration is also looking at this as well, because it's
Michael, some of the stuff you're talking about is outside of the litigation arena, correct?
That's correct.
They're not. We're not discussing those things you can quote sue for, unquote. We're just discussing in general causes of traumatic brain injury. Correct?
Well, we could sue for a whole lot of things. You know that, Mark, and some of the things that we do sue for, in addition to negligence, which is what I do primarily in my legal practice and medical malpractice, is bring lawsuits against insurance companies who haven't been providing these individuals or refuse to provide these individuals with the care that they're entitled to. In suing government entities because they get turned down inappropriately for Social Security disability benefits. We compelling school systems to provide proper education to children and provide a proper education plan to them. So this area of lawsuits when it comes to brain injuries is just not suing because someone caused their injury as a result of negligence, although that is a big part of it. And I certainly don't want to diminish what I do on a daily basis, but it's much more than that.
Do you also handle the other cases? Do you handle cases where...
In my practice and in brain injury in general, people who don't know where to turn for help. And sometimes the best help that they can get is from a lawyer who understands brain injury because there's nobody else that they could turn to. So while many of these things are problems or issues I don't handle directly, or I don't want to handle at times, sometimes I'm forced to because there's nobody else available to my clients to handle it. So if I represent a child who's going back to school, I have to get involved in the issues of making sure that school system provides a proper education to my.
And a lawyer who specializes in school issues might be someone that you could piggyback, I don't know, a piece of litigation with.
Absolutely, because you see, what I understand is brain injury.
Understood.
And a brain injury is an invisible injury. And to the general population or to many professionals, it doesn't make any sense because we're trained to look at someone and make an evaluation of them. So when it comes to disability, what are we looking for? We're looking to see if they're in a wheelchair, if they're walking with a cane, if they have a slurring of their speech, if they're stumbling around. But when a person has a brain injury, this is an invisible injury that you can't see.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, how do you figure that out?
There's several ways we could figure that out.
Before you answer his question, I want to piggyback on that question and ask it a second question in the same vein. Not only does this person not present with an apparent injury, but sometimes he suffered an injury that doesn't manifest itself until much later in life. So please tell us how you deal with both of those issues.
Well, let's go to the second question first.
Okay. Like the football cases where these older athletes are now exhibiting signs of dementia and what have you.
And what we're seeing in those individuals is the end stage of many, many years of repetitive head trauma or many concussions that they have sustained. But what happens with a brain injury is that some symptoms get better, some problems get worse, new problems arise as a person ages and new problems develop. So a brain injury isn't a static injury, it's on a continuum over time. And many people don't realize the problems that they have until they go back and try day-to-day life again. So if they're in a hospital and getting care for, as I say, an orthopedic injury, or because they walked in even with a concussion, and they go home and they rest for 2 days before they go back to work, the problems that they're going to have are not going to become apparent until they go back to work. The emotional and behavioral problems are not going to become apparent until they begin resuming their life. So Bob asked me, well, how do you test for all of this? And I tell Bob, and I tell juries, and I tell lawyers who want to listen to me that the best test for a brain injury is life. Let's look at how this person was performing before the injury took place or the event happened, and how they're performing today. I don't need a neuropsychologist to tell me that. And there are sophisticated neuropsychological tests that can be used to see the impairments a person has. I don't need a neuroradiologist to look at a CAT scan or an MRI to pinpoint the areas of the brain that are damaged, because many times those tests aren't sophisticated enough even to pick up the microscopic injuries that we're talking about, which is a problem in and of itself as a litigator. When those tests come back negative and the defense and the insurance companies say, well, the person can't have a brain injury because the MRI was normal. And I look at them like, they don't have a brain, because the fact of the matter is very simple, that these tests oftentimes are negative and can't find the brain injury that's there, because these brain injuries are microscopic and affect a person's ability to think. And the CAT scan or the MRI, that can't tell you if the person is even alive or dead. So it doesn't give us the information that we're looking for in this area. So the best test is life. Let's talk to people. Let's talk to the person's spouse. Let's talk to the employer. Let's talk to their friends. Let's talk to the priest or the rabbi. Or let's talk to the man who owns the corner grocery store and see what happens when John comes in every day for his coffee, and what was he like before, and what's he like now in that store. No, does he remember why he's there? Can he make the change with you? Can he carry on this coherent conversation? Or is he just a different person?
Well, that gets you to the present, but you talked about the future. How do you deal with that in your litigation? Do you use neurologists or whatever they are, experts to
neuropsychologists or psychiatrists?
We use neuropsychologists. We use neuropsychiatrists. We use rehabilitation physiatrists. We use neurologists. We use education specialists. It's a problem that is particularly difficult when we represent children. The reason for that is their brain is still developing. So when you injure a child at the age of 3 or 4 or 5, we don't know what the outcome is going to be when they're 10, 15, 20. Are they going to have problems learning how to read? Are they going to have problems with complex math? Are they going to have social problems, behavioral problems? As the brain develops, these problems become more apparent, and we just can't tell with a child at the young age. But we have to look at the original injury, and we have to then think a little bit about it and say, well, if they have this problem today, we know that they will have another problem tomorrow, no different than if we have a broken bone and we say, well, you're going to have traumatic arthritis in the future. We just know that's going to happen.
And it's so easy to fail, Michael. If talking about these 3, 4, and 5-year-olds, for all we know, they're Albert Einstein. And if they grow up, quote, normal, unquote, normal might not have been normal had they not had the injury. Correct?
That's true.
They could have been geniuses that have been rendered normal. It's such an odd science that you're dealing with as a litigator to try and prove what might happen in the future, A, and B, those silent injuries that people can't see.
That's true. That's true. That's very true, and that's a problem that we have is in the courtroom, how to project into the future, how far we could go without someone saying, well, you're engaging in just speculation.
We need to take a quick break here, but when we come back, we're going to talk with Mr. Kaplan about the issue of school sports and what moms and dads should be thinking about when their kids come and tell them they want to play football or basketball.
So the first thing I'm going to say to you, or say to the moms and dads, or anybody listening today,
don't let your child play football. No, go ahead.
we can get into that too. That is my opinion.
I understand.
But when your child does play football or engage in any type of sporting event, I want to be clear and say one thing. When in doubt, keep them out. What do I mean? When you think this child had a concussion, please do not allow him or her or a college student or professional athlete to go back in to play again until they are cleared by trained medical people, professionals, to see that their symptoms have resolved. But because if you allow them to return prematurely, there is a greater risk that they will sustain a second concussion if the first one hasn't healed. And there is a great risk that they will develop something called the second impact syndrome that could unfortunately result in catastrophic brain damage or even death to that individual. So everybody has to by the rule, when in doubt, keep them out. And understand that a helmet, while it's important to prevent injuries such as a skull fracture, does nothing to prevent a concussion, because the concussion is caused by the brain moving within the skull itself, forwards, backwards, rotating within the skull, and the helmet can't do a thing to prevent that from taking place. The brain is floating in a fluid substance within the skull. It's soft like jello. And the inside of the skull is very rough with ridges and protrusions. And when that brain slushes, moves within that skull, an injury is going to happen. And the helmet can't prevent it. So don't think because this child is wearing a helmet that they're prevented from having a concussion. And don't be fooled again by marketing people in football to tell you that there's such a thing as safe tackle that's going to prevent these injuries from happening. Because to use a legal term, Mark, that's a lot of bullshit.
That is a legal term. Michael, I want to make sure that we're on the same page, because you said something and I want to clarify it. You said they're cleared by a medical professional, et cetera. At what point do you feel they shouldn't return at all? How many different head injuries? And I realize it's not an art. It's not an art form. But you're a kid. At some point, sports isn't worth what effect it's going to cause on your brain if you have continuous injuries. If you look behind me, it's totally accidental, by the way. But there's a painting of Muhammad Ali. Probably one of the most famous examples of what we're talking about, is he not?
Yes, he is. And that's a result of repetitive head trauma and blows that never reached the point of a concussion. They were all subconcussive blows that Muhammad Ali had. It's very interesting that Muhammad Ali was never knocked out, never was unconscious at any fight at any time in his career. No record of him ever sustaining a concussion, but this repetitive head trauma that he sustained led him to develop a Parkinson's-like syndrome. I had that with a client many years ago. When I was a young lawyer, I successfully, and the first reported case in the country.
You're not a young lawyer now?
No, I'm not young anymore, but proved traumatically induced Parkinson's-like disease in my client, who was a passenger in a car that was involved in an accident with a bus. And
you don't even need to strike your head, do you?
No, you don't need to strike your head at all. That's exactly right. But your example of Muhammad Ali is the perfect example, and it's also a perfect example of something else, that the public doesn't understand the seriousness of what we're talking about, because when they look at Muhammad Ali or they look at movies such as Rocky, these individuals seem to walk away unscathed from these hits to their head. You look at something like the Three Stooges cartoons. They're getting hit in the head all the time, and they're just fine. We look at all kinds of popular movies with the same images being shown to audiences, and people walk away from this, unfortunately, the public, thinking getting hit in the head is no big deal. And that's anything but true. So when you ask me, well, how many hits is enough to take a child out and don't let them return to playing a contact sport, that's something that I think every parent has to decide for themselves, because I don't think there is a good medical answer to this question now. If it was my child, I could tell you that I don't want them to play tackle football to begin with. Let them play flag football, let them play other sports. But I say football is a concussion delivery system.
I agree. I don't know how many lawyers are listening, and I this is probably more of a client show than a lawyer show. But I have to tell you, as someone who's been in the legal arena almost all of my adult life, one of the big battles that are being fought in courtrooms around the country is this issue of, especially with TBIs, is that you can't get a TBI unless you've been rendered unconscious. Here in Michigan, where I'm at, Michigan has a unique no-fault law where you're required to show a serious impairment of body function in order to collect in a third-party case. So in order to prove third-party damages, you have to show a serious level of injury. And when you're discussing TBI, the argument that the wasn't rendered unconscious in the accident plays an important role in that determination. I'm wondering what your feeling is about consciousness and unconsciousness as it relates to TBI.
Well, that Mark, is an unfortunate myth when it comes to traumatic brain injury. You don't need to be rendered unconscious to sustain a concussion or any form of traumatic brain injury. We could look at many examples of that. We don't have to look at examples first. We just have to look at what the Centers for Disease Control says on the subject, or the American Academy of Neurology, or the College of Neurosurgery. All agree that you don't need to be rendered unconscious in order to have sustained a concussion or a brain injury. Anybody who says the obvious should be reported to their appropriate medical board and have their license pulled, because they don't know anything about what they're talking about. Simple as that. Because what I say is those individuals are the best doctors money can buy, and there's another name for that I won't use on the show. I say it's the oldest profession.
It starts with a W. I know it well.
But just look at what we know from just popular news media. We have the unfortunate case, if people remember, the actress Natasha Richardson. She was on the ski slope. She fell. She struck her head. She got up. The ski patrol looked at her. She was talking. She said she had some headaches. She went on her merry way, and 24 hours later, she was dead. So, I mean, we don't have to go any further than that to understand that an injury that could kill you within 24 hours, because in her case, she had a brain hemorrhage that went undetected, is significant and doesn't involve any loss of consciousness. There's an interesting example of that that's taught to every medical student. An individual by the name of Phineas Gage. I don't know if you know about Phineas. Phineas worked on the railroad, and what they did is they were putting rails into the ground, and they banged them down with spikes. And they were doing some blasting at that time, and there was a bit of an explosion, and one of these spikes went through Phineas's head, in one side, out the other side. And if you just Google Phineas Gage, you'll see a picture of that. Well, Phineas Gage never lost consciousness, but Phineas Gage was never the same person again that he was before this event took place. He became an intolerable human being. And that example of Phineas Gage is used in every medical school in the world to teach medical students that you do not. So anybody in the state of Michigan or Mark or any professional in this oldest profession in the world who tells us otherwise is just not being truthful, unfortunately.
I will pass it along to my Michigan colleague. The website that I found your information at is brainlaw.com. Is that correct?
That's correct. www.brainlaw.com.
And the interesting thing I found on brainlaw.com when I looked at your practice areas were some of these, what I'm going to call unusual places, if you will, or cases where someone might suffer a TBI. I mean, the obvious one is a motor vehicle accident. That's obvious. But on your website are things like failure to contain crowd issues, faulty security issues, lighting issues, background check failures, medical malpractice. Can you please, crime victim, can you please discuss the causation in things like this and where liability might be for a person who has been injured and doesn't think they have a case?
Well, they need to see a qualified lawyer and really sit down and have an in-depth conversation with him or her concerning the circumstances surrounding how this incident took place. Because unless you have a qualified attorney looking at this, first, that attorney is not going to recognize the issues of negligence that we talk about today and other issues of negligence. They're not going to understand the rules of the road when it comes to trucking incidents and the special rules when it comes to professional truck drivers and the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Act that pertains to them. When it comes to medical malpractice, unless you have a qualified attorney, they're not going to understand instances of failure to diagnose a stroke, anesthesia errors that take place, failure to treat a person who has an infection properly, leading to brain injuries, sinus infections that go untreated that blow into the brain and cause all kinds of problems, seizure disorders, and they're not going to understand what the person is talking about with their brain injury either, because they're going to look at the person and not understand that the fact, again, that they sound normal and look normal doesn't mean that they don't have an injury. So, you just can't say that you're a negligence lawyer and be right for every kind of case.
In the context of a failure to contain a crowd or a faulty security, I presume we're talking about somebody who is injured or assaulted in that context, or is there some other context as well?
Yeah, that would be crowd control. I mean, that would be the obligation of the landowner.
But an assault has to happen, correct?
Well, there has to be some type of it doesn't have to be an assault. It could be the person falls because the crowd runs over them.
A fall, or
there are many ways that injury could happen other than an assault itself.
Got it.
From ineffective crowd control.
The average person, I don't think, would think that if they got stampeded in at an unruly concert, they could pursue litigation against the concert holder. And I just wanted to make sure that was something that you made clear. Or at Woodstock, where you were at, Bob.
Yeah, right. What are you trying to do to me anyway?
In preparing for this, there was a discussion about the Seventh Amendment and tort reform and how corporate and government interests political interests are affecting people's rights to pursue cases. Is that affecting the traumatic brain injury arena of litigation?
I think it is. I think there are many groups and interests in this country who want to take away someone's right to a trial by jury. And the trial by jury is the greatest protection that we have in this country as a democracy against tyranny, against individuals and corporations that put profits over people and profits over safety. And we need juries to be the gatekeepers, if you will, of what is good and acceptable conduct. We can't rely on industry itself to do that. Unfortunately, we can't rely on drug companies to protect us all the time. We can't rely upon the medical profession to police its own. We can't rely, unfortunately, these days we see at times the police its own. So who do we have left but the jury system to do that? And the courtroom is a great arena for the search for truth. It's not a one-sided affair. Both sides have or should have competent attorneys in that courtroom. And the truth comes out through cross-examination. You could sit on a jury and evaluate a medical malpractice case. You don't need to be a doctor to do that. You could evaluate a case of traumatic brain injury as a juror. You don't need to be a physician to do that either. Juries don't leave their common sense at the courtroom door when they walk into that courtroom. And if they use their common sense and they properly evaluate the evidence, they will most likely come to the right conclusions. Look, I haven't won every case I've tried. Anybody who says that is not telling you the truth. That's just the way it is. But I would say for the most part, juries come to the right conclusions. Whether you're happy with that result or not, they've come to the right result. Trial by jury, that's fixed in the Constitution. And anybody who wants to take away that right to trial by jury is taking away a right that we as citizens of the United States have been given at the inception of this republic. And it's a basic right. And again, it's to protect us against tyranny.
Well, that was a fascinating discussion. Thank you, Michael Kaplan, for joining Mark Bello and myself for this episode of NFN Radio News. We appreciate it very much, and we hope our listeners enjoyed our discussion. Now we're going to take a quick break, and I'll be right back with some closing comments. Thanks, guys, for listening. I hope you enjoyed this podcast, and you'll come back on a regular basis. For regular listeners, you know that we provide narrations of commentary published almost every day on notfakenews.biz. But we've expanded our offering to include newsmaker interviews, and we're going beyond the world of politics for those, presenting guests and topics that I hope you find interesting and enlightening, like this one about brain injuries with Michael Kaplan and Mark Bello. So that's just another reason for you to follow NFN Radio News so you don't miss an episode. You never know who'll be showing up. Check out notfakenews.biz too, where you'll find new material just about every day by some excellent writers with perspectives on a whole range of topics. You can sign up as a member at notfakenews.biz. And of course, it's all free. Also, let your friends know about this podcast and about notfakenews.biz. Our goal is to be informative and entertaining as we comment on the latest developments in the news with just a little lean to the left. Now, this is Bob Gaddy signing off for NFN Radio News and notfakenews.biz.